Okay, welcome everybody. Today is January 15th, 2021, which is Wikipedia's 20th birthday. And I'm very pleased that you were all able to join us. As you can see, we have a pretty fantastic lineup of speakers to talk to us about the significance of Wikipedia. We're going to hear a variety of perspectives. We've got people who were there from the very beginning, and we've got people who have had very limited direct interaction with editing Wikipedia. But I think it's a rare person these days who has no interaction with Wikipedia at all. Wikipedia is something that has really come to touch all of our lives all over the world in a variety of ways, and I'm really looking forward to digging into that. So I want to get started pretty quickly. We've only got 10 minutes each, or 8 minutes each for each of our speakers, so I don't want to cut into that too much. Let me do a very brief introduction of each of our speakers before we get started, and then you'll get to know them better in their section. So first up, we're going to have Ward Cunningham. Ward Cunningham invented Wiki software back in 1995, before the existence of Wikipedia, as a way to help computer programmers collaborate better and share knowledge. Up after Ward will be Lane Raspberry, who has advised organizations from Consumer Reports and the University of Virginia's data science school, where he is now, on how to engage with Wikipedia. Let's see, Robert Deutsch is who I see I have not yet made a panelist. There we go. Robert Deutsch, I have known for probably longer than anyone else on the call. He is our resident outsider. That's a title that he chose for himself, but it's not entirely true. Robert has worked with Wikipedia in a few capacities. He's helped me out with a few projects, and his background in journalism and with universities and the business world gives him kind of a unique perspective on Wikipedia. Sherry Antoine is my partner on my most exciting current project, which is News on Wiki, in which we leverage Wikipedia's unique influence over search engine results to make sure that people can get access to accurate information about newspapers. Let's see, and then we're going to have Jackie Carner, who is an editor of the book Wikipedia at 20, which came out, I believe, in October. I wrote a chapter for that book, and so did many other Wikipedians and researchers. So Jackie is also an active Wikipedian and has a pretty unique perspective on sort of the big picture of Wikipedia. And finally, we're going to hear from Mack Smith, who I think just made a timely exit from the camera. Mack is another who doesn't have a really direct experience editing Wikipedia, but as an activist, as an editor of a hip hop magazine, and in his roles in community building, he is someone who I think can see a lot of parallels in Wikipedia, and also who feels its impact in I think kind of unique ways. So without further ado, I'd like to get started with our park bench format. So in that format, we're going to have two of us at a time, and we're just going to rotate through.
Hey, Pete, can I interject?
Yes, please.
We're actually not broadcasting on YouTube yet. Someone said, am I
No.
missing it? So maybe we should check that real quick.
Well, that is unfortunate. This is my first time broadcasting on YouTube. I think what's going to happen is I'm going to just have to publish this to YouTube afterwards. We will have a recording, and I will do it as quickly as possible afterwards. Something must have gone wrong, and I'm not really
actually
shoot that.
Pete, I'm
Yes.
seeing it. I'm seeing it on YouTube.
Oh, you are?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I guess yeah. So I don't know. Nathaniel James posted on the video that I'm seeing. It says waiting for Pete.
That may have been possibly he posted that before I got it going, because I did get it going a couple minutes late.
It was yeah, and Richard says I don't see anything either. Pharos, and it's these are messages that just popped up: 607, 608, 609. So okay. Sorry, Pete.
Well, Robert, I wonder if you can maybe while we're waiting, if you can jump in the chat session and maybe tell them what you did. I think the possibility that we may just have to show the video to them after the event, because I don't have the time to troubleshoot it while I'm introducing it.
All right.
Terribly sorry about that. So anyway, so let's get started with the first round. So we did get a little bit of a late start. So I'm going to just say, let's start the timer at, let's do 8 minutes for me and Ward, and then we're going to end up running over a little bit, but I think that's okay. So, Ward,
I can
ask me a
talk
few
fast.
questions.
Pete,
Okay.
you know, I met Pete before he was engaged with the foundation, but he's a fellow Portlander and ran the Wiki Project Oregon, which is more than just writing. He loves to write. Cares a lot about words, but the organizing aspect. What led you to think that you could organize authors and produce quality content about Oregon?
Well, I started editing Wikipedia really out of my interest in wikis and also my interest in Oregon. I had been living here. I came out here to Oregon from the East Coast for college in 1991. So about 2004, 2005, I had started to really become aware. This was my home. I had really become attached to the idea of staying in Oregon, but I'd missed out on all those things that you tend to learn as you're growing up about a place. And so I didn't, I wanted to learn more about the history, the politics, the geology, everything about the place to just kind of feel better situated. And
when did you have your first community member who is paying attention and taking advice from you on like how to research things and so forth? Because I know you did a lot of guidance on how to get quality content.
I started working on articles like the article about the Columbia River was one of the earliest ones I worked on, and articles about local elections, state offices, and things like that. And one of the first things that I really noticed was that instead of now I know a common experience for a lot of people is that they try to make an edit to Wikipedia, and then someone yells at them. Someone tells you didn't bring a good source, or you didn't, your grammar is bad, or something like that. My experience was the opposite. And I feel very fortunate about that. My very first experience like that was that I came back to the page thinking that I was maybe doing something wrong, thinking that there might be a problem with it. And I found that people were adding information that I hadn't found yet. They were improving a page that I had started. And it just became addictive to me because it was a way to connect with other people who are interested in learning about the same things and sharing information.
Now, were you spending an hour a day at that time, or 2 or 3, or once a week, or how engaged did you become, and how quickly? And did you see that in others?
I think I probably started off very excited about the elections article for 2006. I was really interested in capturing all that information in one place. And so I was probably working for an hour or so a day on that because I was learning new stuff and adding to it frequently. And I think I started to see that kind of interest in other people too. There are definitely people who spend a substantial amount of time, and then there's sort of occasional editors as well.
And I don't think they had reached their 10-year anniversary, maybe not even their 5-year anniversary.
About 5 years. It was about 5 years.
Were you frustrated at the time that it wasn't recognized as authoritative, as trustworthy?
That's an excellent question, and the answer really is no, not at all. And I don't think I've ever really found that frustrating. From my perspective,
and that's because you just knew it to be trustworthy, or because
no, actually, it's because that to me is not the purpose of Wikipedia. Wikipedia's purpose is to be useful, far more important than to be trustworthy. Wikipedia is supposed to be sort of like a signpost that guides you to the things that are trustworthy. So it helps you, and honestly, like I think that that's what any encyclopedia is supposed to be. If you're doing research, I remember when I was in high school, maybe a sophomore, my history teacher saying, you're in high school now, you can't use an encyclopedia as a source anymore, right? The encyclopedia helps you find the authoritative sources. It gives you a general idea, but it's not something that we should really consider the best research or the most complete research about any topic. And so with Wikipedia, if it's useful, if it helps you find secondary or primary sources that are authoritative, it's done its job. And you might need to double check anything you find in Wikipedia or find anywhere else because it is open edit.
So you've told me that and this comes back from your work with the future of text and so forth, that it's important that authors be able to know the other authors, to know who wrote what, and that you can address them. You know, so if there's a disagreement about how things are written in that, why is that so important? And if I have a wiki where that's not as easy as it might be in Wikipedia, is that a real concern?
Yeah. Well, so Wikipedia's model is kind of different, is fundamentally different from the model of journalism or academia, so in a certain sense, it's not, Wikipedia is designed to make it not important to know the person, to know who the person is. It's not based on the reputation of the person who's writing. It's, you know, it really is. It's the footnote at the end of the sentence that shows you the source that's supposed to carry whatever authority Wikipedia has you know, to influence what you think about something. But in terms of working with other people, it is important to be able to have a conversation. If someone makes a change that you think is wrong, or that sort of opens up a whole dimension of a topic that you never thought of before, you want to be able to have a conversation with them. You want to be able to say, hey, I think you're wrong. This other source says something different, or ask them to explain, you know, to tell you more about what they're doing, or to help you figure something out. And as sort of a more sophisticated reader of Wikipedia too, that can be really useful. So the fact that Wikipedia makes that information accessible in the edit history and helps you, even if you don't know the name or the real world identity of the person who's written something, if you have a way to communicate with them, or if you can learn a little bit of something about their interests. Is this someone who's coming at this article, you know, about the Columbia River because they're interested in the region, or is it because they're interested in hydrology, or is it because, you know, they're interested in Native American history? There's a lot of reasons they could be working on it, and you might see that from what they choose to tell you about themselves, even if they don't tell you exactly who they are.
Thank you for that, Pete. And I know that we're a little behind, so I have a few more questions, and I'm just going to skip them.
All right.
But thank you for nice, informative answers there, and I hope that that's news for some people.
Great. All right. Well, thanks for keeping us on time. I'm going to bring up our next guest speaker, which is Lane Raspberry. And oh, I see. I'm looking at the wrong view here. All right. So take it away, Lane and Ward. And I'm going to just take myself off the screen.
And so now I'm in the hot seat.
Yes. How do you do, Ward? So, Ward, in 2001, you wrote a book called The Wiki Way, the history of everything wiki. When you wrote that book, what kind of finality did you see in the wiki concept, and what has grown from the wiki since then?
Well, you know, that was funny in that, you know, I thought I'd made a great thing and everybody would want a copy of it. And it turns out everybody just wanted to write their own. In fact, it was probably a 1 week into having that thing up, and a friend wrote me and said, well, this is just too cool. I had to stay up all night long and write my own. And there was something magical about defining a markup. And I say, well, if everybody has a different markup, it's going to be chaos. But everybody wanted their own markup. And so Bo Loof and I, Bo Loof was a primary author, but we talked about what really needed to be said. And it was really about how to make a wiki and how to make it suit your community, instead of my wiki is cool and you should do what I do. And that was a good turning point. And it was pretty clear that it was becoming that. That was before the encyclopedia people got a hold of it. And they had a pretty good model of what an encyclopedia was, so they didn't have to go too far. But they have made a note, you know, well, they've told me what they changed from my wiki and why it was important. And that's an interesting story in its own right.
Well, tell me some more about that. So you made the first wiki, 1995.
Yeah.
What was the state of the internet like then? And to what extent did people see the internet as something interactive when you established this wiki?
I think there was there's a lot of experimentation. It was filled with computer geeks because they already had computer accounts. And there was a lot of experimentations. I remember some map stuff that was done. And I said, wow, they could get a map on here. And it was like lines, it was not anything like maps we know today. But user-generated content was yet to become something that people thought about. So it was really pioneering in user-generated. I think that I was successful because it was easy to find a community that wanted it to be successful. In computer programmers, I made it simpler than it really probably should have been, because I knew if I tried to engineer it too much, they would find fault with it. If I made it so simple, they could look at it and say, well, Ward didn't try very hard at this, but I can figure out how to work it. That was the response, I thought. There's this rule that says that for complex systems, if you have complex rule, you'll get simple behavior. And if you have simple rules, you'll get complex behavior. And I definitely more of the latter than the former. But the things that I most admired right out of the bat was the notion of a talk page, that you wanted to talk on Wiki, but not everybody wanted to read your babbling. And so a lot of what I did is edit pages to move the talk down to the bottom and move the stuff up to the top. And the fact that people could just do that with talk pages was pretty eventful. I was also told that my crazy way of making links by jumbling words together, that they had used that for a while. And as soon as they put the square brackets in and let you use an encyclopedic title for a page, that's when it took off, that I had stunted their growth with my crazy way of making links. And I've since, abandoned that myself.
So are you saying that, so you're talking about the camel case versus the brackets for the links. So you're saying that kind of markup actually changed the behavior and the way that people responded to the wiki?
Well, when we were talking about computer things, everything could have a computer name that was kind of quirky. But when you're talking about, the kings and queens of England, you want to spell them right. And, so introducing a markup that it was easy to make a link and have the link read properly was important. And, now we're so familiar with a double square bracket that it's hard to imagine that there was wikis without them, unless you kind of come over to my turf and see this crazy spelling.
Now, if I understand you correctly, it makes sense. In the mid-90s, the first people who would come to the wiki would be computer and tech-oriented people. Can you say more about the transition into general internet users in the wiki? When did non-computer people first engage with the wiki that you saw?
We had a couple of camps in our, we were about the transition from big data centers in, behind glass walls, one computer per corporation, to desktop computing. And that was a very substantial conversion. And a lot of people were interested in the whole notion of actually knowing who's going to use it and caring what they think was new at the time. So that was really what we were talking about, is how does it feel? Not, it wasn't mathematical, it was more emotional, and how to keep people happy and trusting in what the work you're doing. So a lot of the conversation was about that. But you have to have kind of a focus, otherwise people will say anything. And I said, well, don't tell us what we ought to do when writing computer programs. Tell us what you did and how it worked. And that was our accountability. And if somebody was speculating, we just say, well, this is speculation, and say, well, how did it actually work, or have you done this? We didn't. There weren't so many citations because we were actually kind of pioneering something at the time. But we might call it a ground truth, really helped it work. An interesting thing, it ran for almost 20 years, and it became less and less important because that focus was less and less relevant as more and more people just, that's what computer programming was to them. Whereas Wikipedia, I say Wikipedia is about all of history right up to the moment. And you know, it's always going to evolve. There's always going to be a need for new author. There's always going to be a subject that's important. And so it's going to live and grow for a long time and remain important to the world.
You've mentioned several values and ethics. You said that people should trust in it. You've said that people should have simple rules that they can use to express complex behaviors. To what extent were those kind of decisions arbitrary and things that you wanted to set in the culture? And to what extent do you think those were things that just evolved out of the community and perhaps weren't planned by you?
I would say that I had a notion of how things should work because I had done this experiment with Hypercard in my own company where I could watch people interact with, and I knew what excited them. So I wanted to have that feeling. And, you know, in day 2 of operating it, when I had 5 people who were just authoring, I could tell that I had that. So I had this feeling of, and part of it was that you could switch from reading to writing as easily as clicking a button, because before that you'd have to like, oh, I have to go to a different computer, a different part of the computer, run a different program to be able to author hypertext, and doing it in place was important. I picked that up from the Hypercard. Other than that, I think people made it what it is. And when people were trying to tell me how brilliant I was for making this wiki, I said, well, no. My community is brilliant. And the fact that people cared about it and wanted it to be good and devised mechanisms to use what little I had done for them was you know, it was their creation. And I still think that, you know, Wikipedia started 5 years after that, but they were doing a different thing and they had to learn how to do that. And I'm astounded at how good, how repeatable, how confident you can be that you'll get what you expect at Wikipedia comes from the community deciding what you should get when you go to Wikipedia. And the mechanisms, I know that there is this curly bracket thing that can be a little scary right off the bat, but all those curly brackets is how that uniformity got built. And I have a lot of respect for that.
All right, so we're going to have a Q&A session later, and I think we're going to have a ton to come back to. But let's move along to Robert. Thank you, Ward.
Lane's on the hot seat now.
I think you're still muted, Robert.
I said, thank you, Ward. So, and yes, Lane's on the hot seat now. So Lane, I guess you and I have spoken. One of the things I wanted to ask about, since it is a 20-year celebration, is how you got started with Wikipedia.
Oh, goodness.
I know, big broad, I know.
Well, Ward is in Portland. I was living in Seattle through the early 2000s. So that's the same region of the United States. And I came to hear about Wikipedia while I was an undergraduate in college. And I was aware, so I edited Wikipedia the first time in 2004. I actually became aware of a wiki community in Seattle a couple of years later with some of the people who had contact with Ward. So even though I didn't know who Ward was at the time, I feel like there was an activist community trying to share information, talking about free and open software licenses, free and open media, and then Wikipedia as well. And so I edited Wikipedia as a student around that time. Somehow not so aware of this activist community, but the ideas were bubbling through in different places. And I clicked edit and tried to edit Wikipedia in that context.
And then you were hooked from that point on?
I clicked edit to vandalize Wikipedia.
Oh, okay.
So I didn't have good intentions in the beginning, but that's the way a lot of people get started. Then that's not necessarily a bad thing. So in the early days of the internet, now we know that there's behaviors that we should practice: civility, everyone's got their first day on the internet. There's people coming on all the time and they have to explore a bit themselves, but Wiki's very forgiving. If someone vandalizes, there's ways to revert it and talk to the people and say, this is inappropriate behavior, this is appropriate behavior. We work these things out, and it's a very forgiving space. But eventually I gave it a few tries and I got hooked. A lot of people have this story.
So I want to touch on that because you talked about Wikipedia as a civil infrastructure where people can place their trust. Like that's really what it's become. Can you say more about that?
Well, there's a few interesting characteristics of Wikipedia. I say the most attractive aspect of Wikipedia is that people actually read it. So there's so many websites, anyone can start a website, but it's come to pass over the years that Wikipedia has become very popular. Many people around the world in many languages, they're reading Wikipedia. There's different other platforms that drive traffic to Wikipedia. If you're looking for information on a general reference topic, want some objective information, you go to Wikipedia. But that doesn't, the traffic alone doesn't build trust. There's a lot of popular websites. People can actually speak back to Wikipedia in a meaningful way. As Ward was saying, you read it, you can also edit it. There's an editing button there. And there's also, like Ward was saying, still baked into Wikipedia from the very beginning is the idea of having conversations with the other editors. So it's possible to look into the history logs of any given Wikipedia article, see who's been editing, what have they edited, check out how it's been vandalized as well. And when you examine this history and who's done it, and you get to ask questions, make a complaint if you wish, edit it yourself, then that develops trust in the system. And over time, as this happens over and over again with different articles over the years, I think that builds trust in the entire infrastructure of the idea of sharing information in this way.
Yeah, that's great. What about people who believe things that are not true and come back to put something in an article that is then flagged or taken out by people who can demonstrably say that's not true, and then they sort of keep coming back? What about that? That happen?
Sure. So there's different kinds of things that aren't true. So there's differing opinions. So two people can both have valid opinions, maybe political sides. And in that case, you want both of the opinions to be in there, because opinions, it's not about true or not true. It's just differing perspectives in the world. So we want those in Wikipedia well represented. And people do get upset about that when they read an opposing opinion, whether political or ethical or some such thing. But Wikipedia doesn't try to mediate what's right or wrong. It tries to present major perspectives that exist in the world. The other kind of thing that might not be true is a fringe belief or a mistaken belief, something that comes from a source that isn't reliable. And Wikipedia has ways of moderating these as well. If someone identifies a fringe belief, they can bring it to Wikipedia and say, hey, I think this goes in, and there's a mediation process for making a decision about whether to include this in the Wikipedia article. So there can be, say, a minor view or a fringe view about COVID vaccine, and it doesn't mean that someone's spreading misinformation. It could mean that they're really trying to become informed, but somehow they just got a bad source of information or an inadequate source of information. We'll still log these on the top pages of the Wikipedia articles to say someone's raised this issue, someone's proposed it, here's the timestamp, here's the discussion of it. And I think even if someone's bringing fringe views, even if people bring fringe views into Wikipedia repeatedly, they can have trust that they're being heard and that the editorial community has sincerely considered their request to include this in the article. So even if it doesn't appear in Wikipedia, that's a good thing. If it appears in Wikipedia and it's marked uncertain, fringe view, that can be a good thing as well, but there is an editorial process in place.
Yeah, that's very, very important. And since you brought up COVID, I will ask you about that. You talked about Wikipedia being an incredible source of medical information for lots of people. So how do you think the role of Wikipedia as an international source is working right now in the world and for COVID?
Gosh, it's a strange thing. Obviously, the world had a great desire for objective, neutral, general reference information on many topics. And for whatever reason, there just wasn't a commercial model that could keep up with this quickly enough so that there was a major media organization handling this. Certainly there were encyclopedias, but before the wiki age, encyclopedias were updated every few years, perhaps even every 10 years. And with Wikipedia, a major difference in the model of the encyclopedia is it's, if there's an event today, there's a Wikipedia article about it getting made today. So that's a different concept of things. With COVID, I guess something unusual about Wikipedia, it seems to be the case that Wikipedia's, for COVID and for a great many other topics, Wikipedia is the most requested, published, accessed, and consulted source of information on COVID. Certainly, a lot of people talk with each other about COVID. Certainly, people talk with their doctors about COVID. But if you're looking for what is the single most popular source of information, it's probably Wikipedia. And if anyone's got metrics, communication metrics, which show otherwise, we in the wiki community would really like to see that. The popularity of Wikipedia, it really inspires people to keep the information up to date and accurate. A lot of editors are contributing to this. And there's a continual invitation for more people to contribute, sharing whatever news there is about COVID.
All right. Well, I have one more question, although I see Sherry here. I think that's the
I think you have a moment if it's a quick one, Robert.
Sure.
We'll be quick.
Just another thing Lane had brought up was one of the shortcomings of Wikipedia internationally was that major languages don't have enough editors just yet, because the key, as you said, is the human participation and good automated processes. So just thought maybe you'd say something about that looking forward.
Sherry's gonna talk more about this, but it is a shortcoming of Wikipedia that it's heavy on English and heavy on majority demographics and light on non-English and minority demographics. Mm-hmm. So in different ways, we're recruiting more people to do translation, more diverse communities and more diverse perspectives. COVID's not just a medical issue, it's also a social issue, an economic issue with the same is true for any other kind of condition. Sherry, why don't you take it from here? Hey, thanks, Robert.
All right, thanks, Lane.
Sherry, I think you're still on mute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. It's great to see you, Robert. Should I call you Robert or Bob?
Robert, please.
Okay, Robert. So ahead of this, I got a little bit of information just about, some of the things you've done. It's really impressive. I see that you are a mobile app creator and that you are the founder of a company called Dominion, or what was the name of your company?
Yeah, Domania, but it was not notable.
Domania.
Yeah, it was not notable.
Oh, nice. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Talk about Domania or talk about the non-notability of it, because that's relevant to the Wikipedia experience.
Take it away.
What Ward was talking about Hypercard, and it was reminding me of being coming to computers of an age when they were really just becoming something for consumers to play with. And then I had a Mac and I had Hypercard, and playing with that and how that turned into Cold Fusion. And I think for this company, Domania tried to make a web page. I had no idea what I was doing, and trying to create it in Cold Fusion, and then saying, okay, now what do I do? Where am I putting it so that anyone could see it? Was a real challenge. We had a product in 1996 that we got funding to turn into a website, and that was called Domania, and it was one of the first. One of the first websites that published home prices on the internet. With the idea being that when prior to us, and now of course there's Zillow and so many people do it and do it well, but it was I think it was a democratizing piece of content in that way, because people would go to buy a home and they would only have the things the realtor gave them to look at. They would not have a list of 20 or 30 sales that could tell them, well, the realtor gave me these two, but really this one is more like it, or, so I should offer more or less. So it was the idea, or at least the original idea, was to try and give buyers a leg up. And I think since then, before and since then, the internet has done that, right? For almost everything you can think of, it has made the buying process more transparent, either by making the information available or by people who have the information making it available.
That's amazing. So you were sort of a pioneer. So how do you go? What is your first recollection of Wikipedia, and what has been your journey with Wikipedia since then? Yeah,
that's I think that's the question of the day, right? For January 15th, thinking about Wikipedia. I actually don't remember necessarily what my first exposure was, although Pete and I worked at a newspaper together. And so I think we bonded over, we were in proofreading, which is, I think, relevant because we were interested in finding out, what's right. Is this good enough to go? We were the last line of defense for this particular newspaper that we worked for. And in a way, Wikipedia is the last line of defense, I think, for civil society, because if we are not, holding facts in place, they may fly out there. My first exposure was sometime around, we had done this site for a couple of years. We were acquired, and I realized that you were nobody if you were not on Wikipedia, because we understood that the search that came up first was always the Wikipedia entry. So I tried to create one, which I think was slated for deletion. I think is the phrase for being non-notably. And actually, it was a really, really important lesson to learn about not just Wikipedia, but really about any writing. It is so easy to write something that fails the notability test. And that lesson of Wikipedia has been something that I have stressed in my entire career, maybe since I was flagged, which was nearly immediate. So that was really my first exposure. But then I was invited to be part of a Wikipedia screencast in San Francisco, and I got to meet all of these incredible Wikipedia contributors. And it was very humbling because they were all super smart, very nice, really talented, and you could really, they were mission driven. You could just feel it, and that's really, if you work in the internet, obviously everyone was bent on doing something, but this group of people they were really mission driven about making sure things were right, things were correct. That I don't remember who it was, maybe Pete will, but somebody wanted to write something about some particular topic, and they kept writing something incorrect. The editor had to keep stripping it out, and everyone had a story like that of trying to keep their particular section or the thing they cared about or the thing that they had become assigned to in order. I think I was just very taken with that kind of passion and that kind of sort of endless sentinel role. So years later, when I actually worked at a reference company, I got to meet all these librarians. I got to look at all these encyclopedias, both ones aimed at young people and ones that were deeply for doctors or people deep inside a discipline. And then it became, I see how incredible Wikipedia is now. I see how vital it is, again, to, as Lane said, to be a place for civil society, where civil society can put their trust. The long answer. That's it.
And I think you said something about Google queries and an aha moment about Wikipedia and young people.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little about that?
Sure.
As I think this is the last question. Yeah.
Okay. I'll make it quick. We want to hear from Jackie. The so I worked for a company called the Interactive Corp, Barry Diller's company. I'm not trying to give him free advertising, just trying to give context. And we had a website called Life123, also non-notable, that basically united all this content that IAC had produced over the years, and we tried to optimize its SEO. And we went through this process for deconstructing what was winning all across Google. And what we realized was, oh, we didn't have to do any of that. We could have just looked at a Wikipedia page, because it was really, Wikipedia was the model for what Google said, or what we determined Google was looking for at that time. So that was really incredible. That was really like oh my God. Of course, because this clear and concise language, the authority comes from good, clear writing, citing your sources, providing references, and a very, very clear set of keywords that are relevant to the topic. So when you looked at the construction of it, you were like, oh, okay, this is why Wikipedia is so great, because nearly everything of importance is written really to this standard, the standard of good reference. So it became very easy from there. Not to win in SEO, but at least to understand how to make great pages for internet readers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Jackie.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. People don't know this, but I met Jackie a few years ago, and we actually were at a conference together. I think that's where we first met, right?
Yeah, we met at the diversity conference in 2017, actually November 2017. Yeah, we roomed together. That was really great. So I know you, but I'm going to pretend I don't know you, because I don't know what you've been up to over 2020, because that's been a really, wow.
Surviving, Jackie. I've been surviving.
Yeah.
So, I've been thriving, actually. It's interesting.
Yeah. So tell me about what you've been doing in 2020.
Okay, so, well, for those who don't know, Afrocrowd, our focus is the African diaspora, people of African descent on Wikipedia, both in content and editorship, increasing awareness and engagement in the Wiki community, that it exists at all, that there is a Wiki community and they're welcome to join, but also in helping to improve information about people of African descent, if there are any gaps, or if there are any hidden figures, or also in some cases if the information could be improved, or just increasing awareness about sometimes what different groups are doing throughout the movement and how people can get involved. And so we have been over the last year, well, I would say from, when the world changed, from about March to now, and it's still, we're in the throes of it still, of the pandemic. We've been doing a lot of more internal work. We've been doing webinars. We've been holding conferences online. We have been increasing in our participation with partners like Wikimedians of the Caribbean, which, as you know, I help lead that group, and I'm also very involved in. And also we've connected with News on Wiki and that campaign with Pete, and I'm also in that as well. And but one of the highlights for me has been engaging everyone and just finding out how everyone's doing in different parts of the world, you know, dealing with COVID-19. And we connected with people from, you know, all over the place about, you know, how are you doing during COVID-19, and kind of helping to add information about that from different countries. So we enjoy that kind of work as well, like reaching out with other partners. But with everything that's been happening in the world with unrest, you know, concerning protests, especially around the time over the summer, we usually hold something called Juneteenth. And this would have been our third year doing it. And usually it would be just the focus of Juneteenth, which is the celebration of the emancipation of enslaved people in America. And it would come as usually just one event. We would have an in-person event where we would write about anything from slavery to civil rights, etc. And this year, it turned out it was right around the time of some of the peak of people's thoughts around what was happening in the news in that time. So we held a conference instead, focused on civil rights for about 3 days.
Right.
And we had, today we would have had Alexandria Lockett with us, and she asked her to speak at the event and be our keynote, and she was amazing. And you guys missed out because she's a real great person to hear. And from there, we focused on civil rights in Wikipedia, and that from there caused us to connect with others who are also interested in the topic. We connected with the Afro-Latino community, the Dominican group we had over the summer. Then we connected with people at NPR and the Global Situation Room, and NYULA, and the Young Entertainment Advocates for our event on BIPOC community, Black and Indigenous populations, people of color. And it just kept going from there. We connected with NYULA again for an entire week of editing, and which to this day, you know, continues to expand even more. So we've been busy.
Yeah, definitely not a time to slow down. It sounds like you all had great events. Are there videos that anybody can catch up on those events?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
tell me about that.
So we've got some more coming out. We redid our website at the beginning of all of this, actually a little bit before. I am actually new director of AfroCrowd, so was getting situated with that when all this started. And on our page, we're going to be having some more videos, AfroCrowd.org. And we're also expecting to put out some more on YouTube. So from here, you can just search AfroCrowd, and you can find our videos, and you can, from this year and before. And we also have a suite of tutorials to show you how to edit Wikipedia. It's very focused on exactly what we do, which is we focus on the African diaspora. And by the way, because we're women run, the founder, Alice Backer, and I thought it would be important to highlight women as well, since, you know, that's a number that could be improved as well. Partners like Women in Red, for example, we partnered with them for the BIPOC event to also focus on women. So that's an aside. But yeah, anything you want to find out about us is online on YouTube. We're on Instagram, just search #AfroCrowd. And on Twitter, we're AfroCrowdIP. And then you can also go to our website, AfroCrowd.org. But if you want a video of us, if you want tutorials, if you want anything like that, you can find us, because we want to find you. Yeah, so our next event is actually in February 21st. We're going to be at the Schomburg again, and we're going to be joining with some students in the online community, and we're going to be holding our annual Black History Month event on that day. I believe it's from 1:30 to 5, so Eastern time. So if anyone is interested, you know, we're there. And obviously, if you just have any interest at all, we're looking for you, and we'd love to chat.
Mm-hmm. Now, time's running short for us here. I just want to reach one thing, and I have for the volume that I co-edited with Joseph Regal, Alexandria Lockett. She wrote a chapter, so she's amazing, and you're right, she's an incredible speaker. That's why I just love everything she has to say. She actually is teaching, she teaches using Wikipedia at Selman College, which is an all-women's college, HBCU as well. So, and historically Black college university, for anyone who might not know my higher ed lingo, but just really amazing. And she talks about in her chapter about the authorship that she has to deal with, her Black women students coming in and saying, why do I have the authority to edit this page? So going with that, how do you encourage people, and how do you overcome that? Because I know authorship and who has the right to create knowledge and edit knowledge is a huge thing that's a social thing that I always like to discuss and bring up, because some people don't actually think about that. So could you talk about that for a minute?
Of course, it's one of our favorite myths to dispel. From anyone who comes to our events, whether it's online, in person, back in the day, it feels like 100 years ago, is that Wikipedia is still open to everyone, and of any background, any language, and that you can join in the telling of your story, the story of the world, and that's history. So what we enjoy doing is, once you come in, we start everybody from scratch. We've had people who don't even know how to, who have a hard time with navigating a computer, but yet they are a lawyer or PhD. And or we've had students, we've had teachers. You know, we've had events that are focused on all different kinds of themes. But the crux is that you know, we'll start where you are, and then we'll go on the journey together. And when they do their first edit, when you have a Wikipedian that does their first edit, it's really, and they really get excited. They're like, oh, wait a minute, this is live? Yeah, it's live, the whole world can see it.
Yeah.
You know, you get the real one. It's not like a fake one that you start with. So it's cool. And I just want to give a shout out to all the volunteers who help us do this. We started in New York as a meetup, and now we've had people who joined us all over the world. And we're especially thankful for people like you, Jackie, who make an effort to try and, I know your work on systemic bias, and I've come to some of your other things. And also for anyone out there who has taken the time to help other people or to join us at our events. Hypercard was 5 years old this last year, and in February it will be 6 years old. So we're happy to keep on going. We've had one editathon a month since 2015, almost every month.
Wow, that's amazing. And I know that's a lot. That's a lot of planning. Congratulations on that. That's amazing. Well, thank you for chatting with me, and I miss you. Big hugs, of course. I miss the Wiki events, so can't wait till we can all get together again.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Sherry.
Hey,
Hi, Jackie.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
Good.
So I had some fun. I spent some time trying to find out, you know, who is Jackie? What does Jackie do? What I found out is Jackie's really smart. So I don't want to get punked in this interview. So the thing, though, that I really wanted to ask about was, it seems like you started with a wiki because of your love for access of information.
I
You wanted
did.
to be able to share this information with the world. How do you get this information out? You're just really smart. How do you share this stuff with the world? But it seems like you kind of stuck with Wiki because of like the community. So I kind of wanted to like understand how did that kind of play out for you?
Oh, sure. Yeah, actually, I started because I just love knowledge, and I recognize that it's a privilege, and this is something that happened through grad school, and I'm sure many of you out there can empathize with this discussion. But I started in grad school. I said, well, education's a right. And of course, this has been something that's stated many, many, many years ago by many governmental organizations and like UN, things like that. Like, and we're talking in the 40s. This was stated, and I had professors say, "Well, education is a right." And I said, "Well, what gives you the authority as an educator to determine who gets these opportunities?" And let's be honest, the opportunity gap is still huge, and it's something that isn't discussed often. And it's not just here in the US, but it's something that dealing with worldwide. And I see Wikipedia as an opportunity to really equalize that. We have paywalled journals and information, and I don't find that to be very equitable at all, because information access, while it should be a right, is a privilege. I mean, who has, access to materials? University students, some libraries do, some public libraries too, but really, do we want to limit knowledge in that way? And it's something that I got involved with as an academic. I had finished my dissertation, and I just all of a sudden felt empty. I thought, what now? I had like this big sense of loss, because it's something that consumes your entire time. And I'm sure we can all recognize, a big project that we've dealt with or something that all of a sudden it's like, whew, they're just done. And I thought, well, what now? While I wait on edits, do I just sit clicking refresh on my email, waiting for feedback from my instructors? And my husband actually said, why don't you take this humongous document? Because I wrote a qualitative dissertation. And so it was like 200 some pages. It was a big guy. And he says, why don't you take some of those citations and put them into Wikipedia? I said, sure. Okay. And so I started an account, and that actually gave me something to keep my mind busy and transition from that humongous project. And then it just all kind of kept happening. I got involved with the community, and I recognized how engaging it felt. So I don't know if anybody else has been to an academic conference, or just a conference, that's felt very, very professional and very starchy and almost competitive and uncomfortable. And I thought, I don't want to relate to people in that way. I want to talk to people about change and developing things that we can better the world, not fighting against each other. I mean, I didn't come here to like play gladiators, poking each other, with things about, about this theory or that theory. I want to work together. And so I attended my first Wiki conference in Montreal in August of 2017. And I left there feeling so energized, because I had so many different contacts, and so many people were just excited about things. And just everyone was working together for this common mission. And I thought, wow, that's what I like. I don't want to battle anybody for anything. I want to work together to make this place better.
Okay. So I've noticed that you have a lot of really extensive work about disability bias. Can you talk a bit about that and how you got into that? Because it seems like you're really, really into that.
Yeah. Actually, it had started, I guess my first study was in 2008, that I started looking at what it is to have a disability in higher education. And that just kept going further. And then I also studied other marginalized populations, like international students on campus, because a lot of times my fellow students were coming to me saying that they were so frustrated because the writing center wouldn't help them. They wouldn't give them extra time. They would just give them the same help as the native English speakers. I'm like, well, that's not equitable at all. So I studied that experience. And then I went and studied veterans on campus, because I had worked in the financial aid office, and I had been working with a lot of veterans. I loved my veteran students. They were wonderful, because they always come in with these tidy folders. All their documents were neat in a row, and they were wonderful. They had everything. So I talked with some of them, and they said, well, we don't need the traditional undergraduate experience, because they've already had their service experience. And so they were already grown at that point. You know, we've all been, you know, that 18-year-old where we make some mistakes and some choices that we shouldn't have made. Whereas, you know, these people were coming in as, you know, 22, 26, 30, sometimes, you know, even 48-year-old student. And of course, they're not going to make the same choices as those 18-year-olds. So they don't need that sort of guidance and student development. So I studied them. And then I came back for my dissertation and I said, you know what? I think I want to study students with autism. And I started reading. I thought, you know what? I think I could just do a big study and say, what's the experience like for students in higher education? And what I found is that it was pretty generic, that, you know, these colleges were giving sort of template responses. So if you're blind, you get these accommodations. If you're a student with anxiety, you get these accommodations. If you're a student with a blood disorder and you need, you know, accommodations, here's your accommodations. They were all the same. And I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not equitable at all. Sometimes it works. Like sometimes, sure, these two students need extra time, but it didn't seem very, very fair. So I thought, okay, I want to go deeper in this. And so that's where I did. And hopefully, eventually, I will study the experience of people editing Wikipedia with disabilities. So that'd be something curious to know, especially on Wikipedia, as some of the essays and comments on Wikipedia haven't been very disability friendly. So I'd like to know that experience of people and what's going on there.
That's really interesting. Really, really interesting. I also noticed that you are a bit of a linguist. Seems like you speak German pretty well.
Do.
And
Yeah.
it sounds like you're pretty useful in Spanish as well. Is that something that you just picked up, or do you have like a specific interest in languages?
I do. I actually have. I started taking German when I was about 11, and that continued. And I just went and I double majored in my undergrad. I did physics and German, and then I just dropped my physics to my minor so I could graduate and go forward. But I kept German as my major, and it's actually still something that I use. I speak it at home just to try to get my children to know a second language. Which has worked okay. We'll just say okay. But then now in my daily life with wikis, I actually speak German quite a bit. Of course, sometimes it's a bit rusty and not so good after so many years. And actually Spanish is something that I found important to start learning because we have such a high population of Spanish speakers in the United States that I felt like it's just something important to learn right now.
Have you seen any issues with accessing wiki as far as like, you know, the Wikipedians with people that don't speak English? I know it was kind of, I brought up a little bit earlier in the talk, but I'm wondering if you have seen or experienced that as well.
Yeah. You know, language is a huge barrier, and that's something that I think that we don't talk about, not just accessing Wikipedia, but just spaces in general. And that's something I hope that we can move forward, because a lot of our conferences and discussions, communication, it all happens in English, which is very convenient for me, but not at all convenient for a lot of people out there who are wanting to be included. And it's not at all equitable. So it's something that hopefully we can come up with solutions to in the future. You know, we've had some live translations in the past during conferences, which is amazing and wonderful. But that's something that we don't regularly do, which I know there's a cost factor to that, but it'd be nice if we could be more inclusive and equitable in the future.
I also want to say that I saw that you were referenced on Drunk History, which is a show I love to watch on YouTube. So I was pretty excited when I saw that, and I was like, oh my God, you're like a real celebrity. So I just wanted to say shout out to that. I'm not sure if you were as excited as I was when that happened, but I was pretty excited to see that happened.
You know, I was, because actually the article, it's actually a page I created on Wikipedia. It is the 504 sit-ins. So anybody go look that up right now, because it's actually something interesting. A whole bunch of people with disabilities occupied a federal building, and they're like, what do we do? Do we arrest these people in wheelchairs? They didn't know what to do. So it was like, how do we do this? You know? And it was actually because their rights were not being established, you know, during let's see, now I'm blanking on the year. It was 1977. And so it had been several years since the signing of the People with Disabilities Act. Now I'm blanking on it. Sorry, much too much coffee, too little sleep lately. But anywho, the gist of it is that people were not getting their rights met at this point, even though they were already guaranteed. And so they occupied this this facility in San Francisco, and that, you know, nobody knew what to do. And so in the end, people got arrested and things like that. But there wasn't a Wikipedia page about that. I'm like, that was so cool and so awesome. Yeah. And it was just a blurb in, you know, the disability rights movement page. So I created that. And then lo and behold, a few weeks later, it was mentioned on, or a few weeks once, I don't know, it was mentioned on Drunk History. I thought that's awesome. So that was really great.
It's acknowledging emotion. That's pretty dope.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, Wikipedia can get you on Drunk History.
Yeah. Pete waiting for us. Well, thank you, Jackie. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Pete.
How's it going, Mac?
Doing all right. Doing all right. Just talking to smart people, doing a lot of listening.
Isn't it fun?
It is.
Yeah, so I want to just acknowledge that we're a few minutes over here, and thank you to our audience who's stuck around a little later than they may have planned to. I had a little trouble getting things started, so I want to jump right in with Mac. You know, Mac may be the one who the connection is sort of the least obvious, but to me, it's completely obvious of why we need a voice like his in this event. So I'm going to try to ask some questions that might help anyone see that. Well, let's start off with a pretty basic one. Do you remember, Mac, what was the first Wikipedia article that really, you know, caught your attention, made an impact, had an impact on your world of whether it's hip hop or publishing or activism?
You know, I think the first time I actually saw a Wikipedia article, I was probably in high school, and I don't remember what it was for. I feel like it might have been research on a Nat Turner paper I was doing, and what actually
you tell people
about,
just briefly who Nat Turner is? I know we should all know.
Nat Turner. I was doing a paper on Nat Turner. He was a Black revolutionary who he was a slave, and he learned how to read, and he figured out that they should escape. So that's what they did, and it was pretty violent. But I did a paper on that in high school, and I was looking for sources. And as you can imagine, living in Vancouver, Washington at the time, it was really hard to find books on Nat Turner. And Wikipedia had information on it, but it was still really limited. But what I loved about it was that it had sources. And through the sources, I was able to go and find information I needed, like books that weren't even about him, had information about him in them, and I wouldn't have known otherwise. So through Wikipedia's sourcing, I was able to really quickly, get information in like a rural area. So this was back in the late 90s, probably 98.
Cool. Yeah. That's great. So I've got two questions I'd love to just let you talk about each of them. You know, first up, one of the links that I posted next to your name on our event page was a video that from last summer, and I really recommend that people go back and take a look at it. It's about a 10-minute interview that Mac did with our mayor. This was during the Black Lives Matter protests here in Portland. It was really when things were getting hectic over the summer, when federal officers had come in, and there was tear gassing almost on a daily basis. There was, you know, the local police force has since been found in many court cases, and journalists who have been overly aggressive, et cetera. And in the midst of all this, the mayor came out to the protests, and Mac gave a pretty substantial interview in the midst of all that mayhem. And so the reason I'm kind of calling this up is that it's the kind of thing that, like, that is a unique moment to be able to have a direct, unmediated conversation with a significant politician. But Wikipedia, by its standards, would probably not really consider that a reliable source, because Wikipedia wants things that come from an entity that has an editorial board, that has a reputation of fact checking and things like that, and doesn't generally want something that's just from an individual. So Mac, I was wondering if you could kind of comment on that. Like, what was the significance of a moment like that to you forget about Wikipedia for a second, just like in terms of its impact on the city we live in. And what do you think of a publication, you know, with standards like that? What should the standards be?
Well, I think I think it speaks a lot to the way that information is disseminated in general. We always talk about trust. It's the way that we as people process information is through trust. And I think that when you look at something like Wikipedia, it's kind of seems to me like it's coded to kind of think the way that a person would, right? Like a person would say, well, I can trust this source, and so I can take this information and use this for other inputs. And Wikipedia just does the same thing. So if you have a moment like we're talking about this speech where I talk with a Ted Wheeler, or this conversation that I have with a Ted Wheeler, and a lot of information is really covered. There's a lot of ground that gets covered in there, and he gives a lot of solid answers or non-answers about things. And in that, as you're saying, it can't be used in Wikipedia to tell a story. You know what I mean? Just because of the way that it was captured by people on video, by a lot of people on video. It was captured by the news, but they didn't, actually run it. They ran pictures of it, but didn't actually run the story. So therefore, it falls outside of this, And so I think that whenever you're looking at information and trying to, send information up into a larger world, it has to have certain standards to it. But it is difficult if you have, the independent journalists are doing things like we have today, just because the media sources that have the editorial boards and whatnot are typically corporate media, and therefore they have their own agendas, or they're influenced. You have a lot of people say, I just can't run that story. They just can't run that story.
They're playing a role of gatekeepers, and
right?
Wikipedia
And so the
kind of plays into that gatekeeper.
Exactly.
Nature. Yeah.
And so it just plays into that. It's a part of it. I think it's at times it can be difficult if you're trying to tell a story and you can't get the information on Wikipedia. Back when I used to do, like a lot of music stuff, I used to tease rappers that didn't have Wikipedia pages. Wikipedia page, not that important. You can't talk to me, So it's that kind of a thing. Like having Wikipedia means that someone has actually approved you, that someone has, it's like having a check on Twitter,
Yeah. So it becomes this sort of marker of status, which it really isn't intended to be. And like some of the accountability around that doesn't exist because it wasn't intended to be a marker of status.
And that's not Wiki's fault. Yeah. But the thing is, when you become so powerful in the world, then people just bend to power. So if people say, well, in order to have a wiki, there's standards, so therefore it itself becomes a standard. So like now people will actually like source Wikipedia as their source when Wikipedia is demanding sources. So it's like the calculus is being done, but you don't know how to do the start equation sometimes. So you come out with a different thing than you expected.
Cool. So, the other angle I wanted to come at you from is, especially now that you've heard some of our other speakers and gotten a bit more of a sense of how important that sense of community is to Wikipedia, and the ability to create something together across, national borders, across linguistic barriers, different experiences, different education levels. I'm curious what about that resonates for you. Are there elements, I'm thinking about the Black Lives Matter protests, but, maybe in your work as an editor too, where there might be disagreement in a community, but it ends up like talking through that disagreement ends up to producing a better product or to people learning something. Is that a dynamic that you feel like you can see elsewhere in your work?
Definitely. In fact, that kind of started for me is seeing this community, first of all, the Wikipedians is really cool, because I never knew it existed until about a couple of weeks ago. We started talking to me about it. But the first day that you and I had actually met at Lens Park several months ago, and you had talked about, your work in Wikipedia, and kind of what are sources and stories that you can tell and you can't tell, and how that kind of, how the world works on this end. I started thinking about that a lot, and that actually played into a lot of how I as an independent journalist, I thought about, a lot about how if I, tell this story as an independent journalist, is it actually history? If we're looking at Wikipedia's history, I tell this story, I don't have an editorial board. But if I tell this story to Richard Reed at the Seattle Times, he can tell my story. Mm-hmm. And now our story is real. So I think it definitely has real world applications, because the story that you leave behind, especially through something as messy as, like, revolution and changing politics, and and thought revolution and economic revolution, all these kind of things. The story that you leave behind is so important, because everyone at the end of the day wants to be on the right side of history, but you can't be on the right side of history if no one is telling your story. So knowing how to tell your story is super crucial to being able to not only achieve the change that you want, but to communicate the change that you're making to others, so that they can understand what is it that you're doing. Because at the end of the day, it's mostly an information game.
And that actually leads me to I got kind of a follow-up, and I don't know how, we're getting towards the end of our time here, so I'll just make it quick. But something that I've noticed in the Black Lives Matter protests, that in a variety of different instances, is that people who are very involved in the protests often have instincts that run completely counter to everything I know from a world of where you're trying to express yourself to the media, where you're trying to express a message that then is picked up in the news, where the public can understand what it is you're trying to say. So, my instinct, my thought is that if you have a protest, it's because you want to be on the news. It's because you want the public to understand what is your point of view, what is it that you're working towards, right? But there's a lot of people who are involved in it who have a much more sort of pure passion for the outcomes that they want, and they don't really care if someone really understands everything. So I don't have I don't know. I wonder if you could just riff on that a little bit, because it's sort of a point of confusion for me.
They often say that, that, what's the phrase, that the riots are the, the voice of the unheard, the voice of the unheard, right? And I think that's important to keep in mind when we talk about, how people in the midst of protests, especially again in media, you're going to go to a protest in the midst of the passion and ask people questions, and then you're going to get passionate answers. But beyond that, I think that oftentimes those people are beyond words. So it really doesn't matter what they say at that point. And they haven't come out to, at that point, some people are not out there anymore to speak. They're not out anymore to deliver a message. In their minds, the message is clear, and all that they have left is action. So there's definitely, a variety of people across that spectrum. There's people who want to communicate. There's people who don't want to communicate. There's people who want to fix things. There's people who are not interested in fixing anymore. And I think that's a wide, if you include all those people together, it's a wide coalition. And so you see a lot of information that's designed to take those people and break them apart.
Yeah. All right. Well, my time is up here for this part of the interview. So we have, let's take 30 minutes for questions and answers. I am hoping that some of our participants here in the webinar have questions, which you can put it in the chat, and we can, as we select your question, we can turn your microphone on and you can just ask them yourselves. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, you can ask a question in the YouTube chat, or also on Twitter using the hashtag #OneWorld, and we'll see all of those. And then also, to all our panelists, why don't you turn your video back on now, so that we can all answer the questions that come in. And finally, and the Wikipedia talk page is another place you can ask questions. So we'll be monitoring all of those as best we can, and hopefully we get to yours. Let me just point out one other thing here, is that when we're done with the Q&A, and before we transition to the Wiki Dojo, I'm going to be lighting up the candles on my Wikipedia 20th birthday cake. So if you have any kind of treat at your house, yeah, there we go. Looks like Lane's ready too. So we'll have a few minutes between the Q&A and the Wiki Dojo where we can have a piece of cake, maybe open a beer or something like that. Okay, so let's see what kind of questions we have. Sherry, you can't turn on video. Let me do it for you.
I did not get the memo about Wikipedia cookies, by the way.
And we could start off, if any of the panelists have questions for each other that you weren't paired up with, now's a great time to get this Q&A session rolling. So feel free to just speak up as we wait for our audience questions to come in.
Mac, I'm going to ask you a question now. How do you see Wiki working with and enhancing what you do?
I don't know. I'm still thinking about that. It's like that's the question that's really come out of this for me this week, and I don't have an answer yet. But I'm definitely thinking about it, because there's just so many applications there, and not to turn it into a thing. But I know a lot of people, surprisingly, when I was just talking about this on Twitter, a lot of people were like, yeah, I love going in Wiki and making changes. And actually, my son, he's a 17, he was like, yeah, I make Wiki changes. And I was like, you do? He was like, yeah, totally, Dad. Come on. Like, I didn't know that was just a thing people just do. So, I don't think I had the authority to just go and make a change. But that's really cool to me, because it means that, we really can tell our story and open it up for debate. I think a huge issue that we have in protest culture is that people don't talk to each other on the other side or outside of their own ideologies. So in Wikipedia, it forces that conversation in a non-confrontational manner-ish, less confrontational manner, at least an intelligent confrontational manner, to have that information really, stand up on its own legs. And I think that's extra important when you're, in a fight for truth.
One thing, I'm going to insert this quote from Alexandria Lockett real quick, because she couldn't be here, but she said in her chapter, Wikipedia serves as a subtle but powerful form of information warfare against colonized populations. And I think that was so, like, I just, of course, like me with my highlighter on her chapter. But I think that's just so important to consider as, activism, that, editing Wikipedia is a radical act. And I gotta love your son being like, yeah, Dad, because I get that all the time from my daughter. So goodness, teenagers, but we didn't know, we didn't have those things, growing up. Of course, the internet and news, those weren't things that we had the authority to interact with. But now kids online, I guess everything's editable to them. And thank goodness that they're more comfortable and more confident sharing that information, and we can have them do more meaningful things to really break down those barriers.
Several of you have brought up Dr. Lockett in your chats, Alexandria Lockett. And I just want to take a moment to say how much we miss her here. She was, due to an unforeseen major personal event, she wasn't able to join us today. So our hearts are with her, and we really look forward to doing an interview or something like that in the future with her at a better time. If you want to follow this YouTube channel or follow me on Twitter, I'm sure that we'll probably have an announcement about something like that in the future. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat coming up yet, so feel free to keep throwing them out there until we hear from our audience.
I would like to know from Mr. Cunningham, what was going through your mind when you were just like, got an idea? Like, what were you doing? What was there anything special going on? Were you like trying to solve something else? Or was this just something that you always wanted to do? Because I know myself as a person who like dabbles in code, I'm not really a developer by any means, but I've always thought of like, I need a system that will help me, like a computer system that I could like imagine that would help me like, take all my thoughts and put it in one place. And pretty much it would just be Wikipedia. Like, so what was it that sparked that, I guess, that moment for you?
There were two sparks. One was falling in love with Hypercard and having an experience there. And then the internet, when it was finally in my fingertips, I said, I want to take what I had on Hypercard and put it on the internet. They're both hypertext, but one is pictures, the other is text. But I knew what I wanted, and I didn't think it was far away, and it turned out to not be far away. But when I felt it, I said, yes, that is it. So
Ward, just to break in, I think we may have some people here who've never experienced Hypercard, could you just say a couple words about what that
Oh, well,
is?
Hypercard, you know, when a Macintosh had a screen this big, about the size of an index card, Hypercard was a program where you could paint on that and have a stack of cards and flip them and this, that, and the other. And it just really matched with that size of the thing. And it was a content authoring system that had a simple but powerful model. Now, because I like things that compute, and I spent a lot of time roaming around the university finding calculator labs, and they had these cool calculators and they could do 6 instructions, and I'd try to figure out what could I do with that calculator that nobody else had thought of. So Hypercard, I still had that, you know, kind of what do you call it, tinkerer's interest in it. I said, well, what does it want to do? And it was that, what does it want to do? And I said, well, I need some sort of database problem that doesn't fit into rows and columns. And you know, I worked in a lab, and we were always worried about why people would or wouldn't pay attention to ideas that came out of our research lab. And I just had this feeling that engineers are very conservative, and they won't use an idea unless they've seen it work before. So I wanted to track that flow. So that was, hey, that's the kind of thing I could do with this Hypercard because it fits what Hypercard wants to do. So in a sense, the designers of Hypercard taught me how to think about hypertext. And once I saw it work and I couldn't chase these people away from my desk, I want my computer back. You know, that I knew that I had reached into something that was very deep.
Yeah, we actually have a follow-up question from an audience member. This is from David, who was actually a student in my writing Wikipedia articles course several years ago. And he's wondering, Ward, what do you think about Lotus Notes or Domino, which is another software by Ray Ozzie and is a platform inspired by Plato Notes. And he mentions collaboration, groupware, and he says it was the first NoSQL database.
Oh, Plato is awesome. And in fact, I had an opportunity to, maybe 10 years ago, long after Plato had come and gone, to read some of the reflections and people who were there, because they had taken the computer, which lived in the world of researchers at a university. The university would do research on a computer, and they said, well, let's make this be something that's just available in every room, every classroom, whatever. They had done that, thinking it was an educational tool. But then the people using it said, well, let's make a chat program. And I don't think anybody had ever done a chat program before, but they made it. And Ray, I think, was there doing it. Maybe he wrote it, but Ray Ozzie knew what that feeling was like there at University of Illinois. And so then he, on a PC, just says, well, let me recreate that experience. If there's a common message that says, if you feel something and it touches you deeply in the way you interact with the machine, then there's something in that machine that's worth duplicating.
I just wanted to add this, Pete, while I was here in work, just so I don't know if you can see this.
Oh, it's turning
see
me
your back.
Yeah, it's just, it's, yeah. It's
Oh, there you
Oh,
go.
look
Yeah,
at that.
That's it. Oh, that's a bigger than average one, though.
Yeah.
They
This
were
is a-
smaller when they were new.
Yeah. I
Excellent.
happen to have that.
A plus for the visual display.
Yeah,
I feel like we're sort of, we got the Mr. Rogers thing going on here where we're picking stuff up off our desk to show to the camera.
Listen, my background is from Wikimedia Commons, so
Excellent. Yeah, and I saw your comment. It's from Archon Fung, who is a friend of Wikipedia as well. Is a professor at Harvard who's done some good work around transparency. It's very cool. We've got some questions coming in now, and I just want to mention to our Zoom participants, there's a separate from the chat. There's a Q&A feature, so we have one person who's asked a question there. It's a little easier for us to manage if you can ask questions using Q&A. You're welcome to ask them in the chat too, but I would prefer the Q&A. So we'll start off with one from there. And this one is from London Jack Books, who I know as a dedicated wiki source editor. I believe also a Wikipedian. Also, many of us work on many related sites, but Wikisource is a project for republishing classic public domain texts and making them more accessible. So she asks, Mack, you began a comment stressing the importance of knowing how to tell your story. And she would be very interested to hear more on this subject if you care to elaborate, or if you could be directed to some other source that addresses that issue.
I think that and when I say my story, I mean our story, like our story as like a city and as a people here in Portland. I can't say that I know full on how to tell our story. I definitely can't say that, but I know that it has to be told in more than alt magazines, and it can't just be told on Twitter. It can't just be told on people's Medium accounts. If we're not able to access the halls of power through the media, through the New York Times or whatever, and we have been able to crack a bit of that. But if we're not able to really tell our stories in those ways, what other ways are available to us? If we have sources and information, what other ways are there to tell our stories? So really, sometimes it becomes a matter of trying to elevate something enough that the press becomes, reputable. Perhaps that's the answer. Perhaps we have to elevate a sort of independent or Black press that becomes something that is acceptable to the larger powers that allow us to then break into the spaces like Wikipedia or wherever else, or the AP or whatever it is. So, we've seen it in the past, we've seen far less, quality papers break in with the Daily Caller and things like that. So it becomes a matter of being reputable and being consistent and making sure that, again, that we are following values that can be understood.
Yeah.
So it's always a work in progress.
I'd like to jump in. I've got a little anecdote that really relates to that question. In 2011, I think this was after I had left, but after I'd left the Wikimedia Foundation. I'd worked there for about a year or two. But every year, at least pre-COVID, the Wikimedia community has a big annual conference somewhere else in the, every year it's somewhere else in the world. And so that year it was in 2011. I'm sorry, in 2011 it was in Israel. And of course, we knew, those of us working at the foundation, many people were very aware that was something that was going to be problematic in our community, because what it means is that an enormous chunk of our community, especially an enormous chunk that we really want to be making better contact with and building bridges with, simply cannot attend, because there are so many Muslim countries that do not have the ability, people do not have the ability to travel to Israel. They can't get a visa. If they could get a visa, it would be an incredibly stressful experience just going through the airport security, et cetera. So the then executive director of Wikimedia, Sue Gardner, organized, she did this in her personal capacity, but I think it was as sort of a nod to that issue. She organized a tour to the West Bank after the conference was done. And so I think about 20 of us went on like a 2 or 3 day tour of the West Bank. Now the tour guides, I think, were really sharp and sort of recognized the opportunity they had with us, that they could get some pretty impressive people to talk with us because they had Wikipedia visiting them. It was a little bit awkward for us because we aren't reporters, but they were sort of treating us as if we were a delegation from like CNN or the BBC or something, right? We got to meet with the head of IT of the Palestinian Authority for several hours, the mayor of Jericho for several hours. Not his staff, not like a quick little meet and greet, but like an in-depth conversation, plus a number of cultural places. And the one thing, I know there's a long preamble, but this is really what stood out so strongly to me in that instance, was that in 3 days of being there, the thing that I learned about the Palestinian people that I met is that these are people who know how to tell their story. They know that they are up against an information machine in the Israeli government and in all of the, that the world tends to hear their story mediated by their adversary, right? And if they want their story to get out to the world, they have to kind of package it up in a way that's easier for people like us to understand. They have to be good storytellers. They have to be compelling. They have to use examples that land for us, you know? And so that's sort of the thing. It's like, that's very different, I feel, than a lot of what I see out of the Black Lives Matter movement here, which is much younger, you know, is much, I mean, not just the age of the individuals, but like in terms of a movement, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been going on for, you know, many, many decades, centuries even. And, you know, so that I think is maybe one of the big differences there. Anyway, I just took a lot of time with that. So I'm gonna jump to another question here.
Can I follow up with Mack real quick, actually?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Don't need to take much time, but Mack, I want to know, because I know oral histories are something that I am passionate about, including on Wikipedia, and I enjoyed some of the oral histories, getting to digest those at the San Francisco Public Library when I was there several years ago, that were from the civil rights movement. Do you find that oral histories, you know, personal accounts, experiences of these times will be beneficial to include on places like Wikipedia to help tell stories and tell the story?
Was this for Mack again? Yeah.
Seems
Mack,
frozen.
any further? Yeah, it looks like we've maybe lost Mack for a moment. I'm going to hope that he heard your question, and if he unfreezes, he can jump back in.
Sure.
For the moment, why don't we move on? Eric, who comes to us from the Federated Wiki community, is asking. I think Lane and Robert, I think the two of you were talking about this a bit. Maybe someone wants to elaborate a bit more. He says, can any of you speak to how you see people learning how to make the transition from Wikipedia vandal to Wikipedia contributor? And how does the community learn how to help people make that transition? And I'd say this question is for any of you that want to jump in. I think most of us have some experience with that.
Well, Lane is the one who admitted it.
Yeah, well, a lot of people, their first edit on Wikipedia is what we generously call a test edit, which means they click the edit button and put whatever they feel like into the article. There's different ways for the wiki reviewers to detect this, revert it, put it back to the way it was before, and send the person who did the test edit, or perhaps vandalism, a welcome message. Said, hey, a real human saw what you did. You're actually welcome to contribute constructively to Wikipedia. Why don't you come talk to us? And so in this way, vandalism isn't a problem for Wikipedia. It's actually a channel for recruitment. Someone can start as a vandal or doing whatever they think, and they're gonna think, okay, a human saw what I did. People notice me. And maybe the person isn't going to come back a few minutes later and edit. Maybe they're going to actually keep vandalizing until they also have the experience of being blocked. Like, how much can I vandalize before I get blocked? And the answer is 3 times. But whatever the case may be, after that happens, even if somebody's blocked, if someone were to ask them a month later, a year later, 5 years later, have you ever edited Wikipedia? That person's going to say yes. They're going to have a memory of having edited Wikipedia. They're also going to know how it works. They're going to be able to explain how it works. And they're going to say, those Wikipedia reviewers, they watch everything that you do. And it can happen that the vandal then creates a new account, maybe discards their old identity, why mention it, and then does something constructive in the future. There's a lot of people who have this story on Wikipedia.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. All right, so here's a bit more of a media theory question. Laura Miller, who I happen to know worked at one time for the Center for Media and Democracy, so has a pretty interesting view on the way that different media platforms and organizations interact. Laura asks, since Wikipedia began, the internet has developed quite a bit. Thinking about the rise of social media, has it had an impact on Wikipedia, or has Wikipedia had an impact on social media? Or do these two phenomena not really inform each other?
I'll offer the answer that social media has discovered the algorithm and given algorithm a bad name. You know, I was a computer programmer. I was very proud of algorithms, but that is a tool of a different business model, and Wikipedia has flirted once, I understand, with advertising, and it was corrected immediately that it's a different model of funding, and I think that makes them completely different animals. There is a user-generated content element of that, but no, it's completely different. I don't know if other panelists agree with that.
I think the observation about algorithms is a really important one. I put together a piece for the Misinfocon blog a year or so ago about what the title was. How has Wikipedia dodged the scrutiny, or the I don't remember the word I used, the challenges that social media have from government regulators. And that was kind of the number one. You know, I explored like several different dimensions to it, but that was the main one, is that, you know, when Twitter and Facebook and YouTube get into the business of trying to anticipate what you want to see and weighting certain things a little more heavily, or, you know, moving things in or out of your feed according to what they learn about you. Yes, it helps them do stuff that can be good for their business in terms of making a feed that's more interesting to you and that allows them to sort of capture you in their world and stay relevant and interesting. But they're also exerting tremendous influence over what you learn. And Wikipedia has always tried it just doesn't get into that business. Wikipedia makes no effort to present a feed or a stream. It encourages you to chart your own path. And I do think that's a huge difference in just the fundamental way that they're structured. Is Wikipedia puts those decisions in the hands of the reader themselves, rather than trying to make those decisions for them.
I agree with that, Pete, and with Ward. Wanted to underscore that, say that social media taken as a whole does look like the evil anti-Wikipedia, because it eventually, as you said, its aim is to sort of shrink your worldview, as opposed to Wikipedia's aim, which is to expand your worldview. I think the other thing that is worth mentioning about social media is perhaps getting this generation, I think, as Mack and Jackie said, to be comfortable being instant content creators, that they came to a blank slate. Oh, what's this? You know, Instagram. Oh, I see. It doesn't have anything. Oh, I have to bring my own followers to Kickstarter. You know, whatever it is. The idea that these are just platforms. You have to do it. And then finally, what Lane said about someone being there and correcting you from being a vandal. You can be a jerk on social media, and there is no sort of friendly, course correction, right? In fact, there may be a celebration of behavior that's not good. So I think those three things are worth mentioning.
All right, great. We have another question. This is from Robin Weiss. And Robin asks, this I think could go for anyone. I'm going to ask Sherry if maybe she wants to take this. I think you may be the only one who hasn't spoken up in the Q&A session yet. What was the first article you remember editing? Yeah, and is there a story around it?
I wrote about someone that I know who, she was the first, one of the first women in the diplomatic corps. She was an ambassador to Madagascar. I believe she was the first Black woman who was an ambassador to Madagascar. And she also has a connection with Gloria Steinem. She worked at I believe, I don't have the article that I have right in front of me, but I believe that it was in New York, and she was one of the only Black women working at that company where Gloria Steinem spoke about, came to the company and spoke to the women of the company. And she had actually invited Gloria to come in her position as junior executive, account executive at the time. It was back in the late 60s. And so she just has an amazing story, and she's done a whole bunch of other stuff. This is just the tip of the iceberg. But she's just someone I happen to know of, and I thought that she deserved a Wikipedia article. So that was my first one.
Great. I think if anyone else wants to jump in on that, feel free. Also, Mack, I don't know if you, I think Jackie had directed a question to you earlier, and we had some tech issues. So if you wanted to jump back on that, you're welcome to.
I would have to be reminded what the question was because I was trying to be heard and I got cut off.
Gotcha.
Well, if we have a moment, I was asking about oral histories. Oral histories is something that some of us are really excited to include on Wikipedia because people can tell their own story. And I'm an ethnographer. I love hearing stories of people and their own experience. And when I was in San Francisco a few years ago, I loved going through and listening to some of the oral histories of people from the civil rights and disability rights movement. Do you find that, you were talking about telling stories, do you find that sharing personal accounts would be helpful as a way to tell the stories of activism?
I'm actually happy that we came back to that question now instead of answering it the first time, because I've heard more and I thought about it a little bit more. I think that having people be able to do that could be helpful, but it could also be like extremely distracting and also just kind of muddying. And I think that one of the things that makes a wiki so amazing is that it's not a news source. It's not really an information source. It's a place that people can go and get information, but it's not the source, right? It's just a place that has fleshed out the sources. So to kind of add in like source information, I think it muddies the water, and it actually kind of puts it into that social media boat that Pete was just talking about, how it's user content, but it's not just like a branding content. That's what that kind of lends into when you start having original content, is it turns it from, Wikipedia to Netflix, and all of a sudden you've got a different thing going on.
Great. So Sherry, I'd love to hear your follow-up. I just want to mention, I think after that, I think we've got a great question to close on. So I just want to let you guys let this rattle around in your head. Someone anonymous is asking, quite appropriately, there's so much anonymity in Wikipedia, is asking, Wikipedia at 25, or actually it's at 20, how would you measure its success? So maybe if you can think of a couple word answer for that, we'll come back to that after Sherry.
I just want to jump on the last question with oral history. Hypercard actually ran an oral history project with Columbia University. They have an MA in oral history, the Columbia History Oral History Master's Program. And so in 2017, we got together with them, and we for the next 2 years, we worked with them on getting oral knowledge on Wikipedia. We had what's called a recordathon, which is to exactly what it sounds like. It's a Wikipedia editathon, except with the added oral knowledge component. And so we had people come and talk about their, for example, we had people come and give short tidbits of oral knowledge on their passage as immigrants to the country. So our concept was that it would accompany articles on Wikipedia, because right now you can't use oral knowledge as a standalone device on Wiki. But we're hoping that in the future, oral knowledge, as it is considered in many parts of the world, especially the global south, that it will be considered part and parcel with oral knowledge, with written knowledge that is accepted in majority Western countries. So that's actually an avenue that that hopefully will open up in the future.
All right. Thank you. All right, so so let's try to wrap this up in about the next 2 minutes or so. Who's got a thought about how do we measure 20 years of Wikipedia? How do we know whether that's a success or not? Lane?
Oh, Ward speaking, but he's muted.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Well, now I got to really be intelligent. No, I was going to say, what I'm most proud of Wikipedia is its effort to be diverse, and I know that's a long road, but I think if it is as important to all people in the world as it is for white men in America, that would be enough. It doesn't have to be better for me. It's already fabulous, but to be there for everybody in, as it's promised, every language. So that's how I would judge it. And I think it's trying hard.
Great. I would think one thing I often notice in the ways that Wikipedia is discussed is that it's I think there are two fundamental ways to look at it, and I think a lot of the world tends to look at Wikipedia as, first and foremost, as an editorial product, as an encyclopedia. It calls itself an encyclopedia, right? And Wikipedia is it is certainly, I would say it's certainly a success as an encyclopedia. It's it's credited with basically knocking the Encyclopedia Britannica, sort of the classic encyclopedia, out of print. It had such an impact that it messed up its business model. It certainly has done a lot. It has accomplished a lot in terms of what we would expect from an encyclopedia. But to me, I think that's actually kind of the secondary consideration with Wikipedia. I think the thing that's really revolutionary about Wikipedia is that it has provided a platform kind of similar to social media, but much, much better than social media, for people all over the world to come together in pursuit of the truth, right? Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, often it's like my narrative against yours, and there's no mechanism whatsoever for trying to come to consensus. People talk about sort of the echo chamber effect, that or filter bubbles, that you tend to hear from people on social media that have similar views to yourself, and so it just reinforces what you're already inclined to think. Wikipedia, as a basic premise, says, like, here is we have one place to tell the story about this topic. And when there are different views, we've got to weave a narrative that incorporates those different views. Some articles do better than others, some individuals do better than others. But I think the importance of that project and a platform that makes it possible for us to do it, I think that's the biggest impact of Wikipedia, much more than any big collection of words could be, because we've already had big collections of words before. But something that allows us to interact with each other in this way, that I think is brand new with Wikipedia.
I think it's going to be hard to follow that answer, Pete. I think you just sort of brought us to a standstill.
Mic drop.
All right. Well, I think we probably have 6 other people here who are capable of their own mic drops, but maybe we've heard a few of them along the way. So let's end this section. Thank you so much to the audience for your questions. I want to make a couple of quick acknowledgements as well. In addition to our speakers, so Lane is going to help out with the Wiki Dojo. And I want to also acknowledge David Boville and Inger Mette Stenzeth, who are 2 friends from the federated Wiki world who were hugely influential in just getting this going, and who put together related events themselves around Wikipedia's birthday. And also my brother, Nicholas Boudreau, did the image that's on the park bench image that's on our page. And he turned that around in, I think, less than 24 hours. And I just love it. I hope you all do too. I think it sort of captures the sort of spirit of fun and informality that we were going for with this. And I'm glad that we were able to bring such great ideas together in a session like this. So let's break for, let's say, until 10 minutes past the hour, and then we'll come back and we'll do the Wiki Dojo session. And unfortunately, if you're watching on YouTube, we're not planning to stream the Wiki Dojo live because we're going to be asking audience members to make contributions on the fly, and we don't want to put anyone in a position where it's automatically going up there. We may post it or post excerpts from it to YouTube after the fact. So thank you for everyone for attending, and I'll look forward to seeing those of you on Zoom in 10 minutes.